I used to travel a lot for work as a pharmaceutical sales rep, which meant staying in different hotels and motels practically every week. After 5 years of doing this job, I thought I'd seen every type of accommodation imaginable. Luxury hotels in major cities, budget motels off interstate highways, bed and breakfasts in small towns. You develop a routine when you travel that much. Check in, evaluate the room for cleanliness and safety, set up your laptop, review your presentation materials, get some sleep, and move on to the next location. The thing about budget motels is that they're hit or miss in terms of quality and management. Some are family-owned businesses that take pride in providing clean, safe rooms at reasonable prices. Others are barely functional operations where the owners do the absolute minimum to keep the doors open. As someone who stayed in dozens of these places every year, I learned to spot the warning signs pretty quickly. Burnt-out exterior lighting, parking lots full of long-term residents living in weekly rentals, front desk clerks who seem nervous or unwilling to make eye contact. This particular incident happened in March, somewhere in rural Tennessee. I'd been driving for about 6 hours and was getting too tired to safely continue. It was around 10 p.m., and I needed to find a place to stay for the night. The GPS showed a few options in the next town, but when I got there, most of the nicer chain hotels were either booked solid or way over my company's reimbursement limit. The only available room was at a place called Pine Valley Motor Inn, one of those independent motels that probably hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The exterior didn't inspire confidence. Half the letters in the neon sign were burnt out, and the parking lot was poorly lit with several broken fixtures. But I was exhausted, and it was late, so I decided to make the best of it. The front desk was staffed by an older woman, maybe in her 60s, who seemed friendly enough. She took my credit card information and handed me a physical key attached to a plastic diamond-shaped tag. "Room 127, she said, around the back of the building. The room was exactly what I expected from a budget motel. Worn carpet, dated furniture, a small television bolted to a dresser, and a bathroom that had been cleaned but showed decades of use. The air conditioning unit under the window was loud but functional, and the bed seemed clean enough. I'd certainly stayed in worse places. I set up my laptop, reviewed my presentation for the next day's meetings, and settled in for the night. I'm usually a pretty sound sleeper when I'm traveling, probably because I'm often physically and mentally exhausted from long days of driving and client meetings. But that night, I kept waking up to sounds from the neighboring rooms. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, muffled conversations through thin walls. Budget motels aren't known for their soundproofing, so I tried to ignore it and focus on getting the rest I needed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like someone trying the handle on my door. Not knocking, just quietly testing whether the door was locked. I lay still and listened, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe someone had mistaken my room for theirs. But then I heard the sound again. Definitely someone manipulating the door, handle very carefully, like they were trying not to wake anyone up. I got out of bed quietly and looked through the peephole. The exterior lighting was so dim that I could barely see anything. But there appeared to be someone standing just outside my door. I couldn't make out details, just a dark shape that seemed to be waiting. My heart started racing, but I tried to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. maybe it was hotel maintenance checking doors, or maybe another guest was confused about which room was theirs. After about 5 minutes, the shape moved away from my door. I waited another 10 minutes, then looked through the peephole again. The hallway appeared to be empty. I went back to bed but couldn't fall asleep. Every small sound made me jump, and I found myself listening intently for footsteps or voices that might indicate someone was still prowling around outside. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to the front desk clerk. When I checked out, it was a different person from the night before, a young man who seemed distracted and uninterested in my concern. He said they hadn't had any reports of prowlers and suggested that maybe I'd heard sounds from a neighboring room. His dismissive attitude bothered me, but I was eager to leave and get on with my day of client meetings. I didn't think much more about the incident until about 6 months later, when I was preparing for another sales trip through the same region. I was researching hotels online and happened to do a Google search for Pine Valley Motor Inn to see if they had a website or updated photos. Instead of finding marketing materials, I found news articles. 3 months after my stay, a guest at Pine Valley Motor Inn had been assaulted in her room during the night. According to the police report, someone had used a master key to enter her room while she was sleeping. The victim, a woman traveling alone for business, woke up to find an intruder standing over her bed. She managed to scream and fight back, and the attacker fled, but not before stealing her purse and laptop. The police investigation revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the previous year, there had been multiple reports of break-ins and thefts at Pine Valley Motor Inn. Guests reported items missing from their rooms, unexplained sounds in the hallways at night, and suspicious individuals hanging around the parking lot and exterior walkways. The motel's security was practically non-existent, no cameras in the hallways, no security guards, and apparently poor control over who had access to master keys. But the most disturbing detail in the news articles was the description of the suspect. Multiple witnesses described seeing a middle-aged man with graying hair who seemed to have unrestricted access to the motel property. He'd been spotted in employee areas and using what appeared to be official keys to enter rooms. Police suspected that either an employee was involved or someone had gained unauthorized access to master keys and was using them to target vulnerable guests. Reading these articles, I realized how lucky I'd been. The person trying my door handle that night was probably the same individual who'd later assaulted another guest. If I'd been a heavier sleeper, if I hadn't woken up when someone tested my door, if I'd opened the door to investigate the noise, the outcome could have been completely different. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of the motel's night maintenance worker, a man named Gary Hutchins who'd been employed there for over 3 years. Hutchins had been using his master key access to enter guests' rooms while they slept, initially just to steal small items like cash and electronics. But his behavior had escalated to more serious crimes, including the assault that finally brought police attention to the pattern of incidents. During his arrest, police found stolen property from dozens of motel guests in Hutchins' apartment. Items dating back years, suggesting he'd been victimizing travelers for a long time before anyone connected the dots. Credit cards, jewelry, electronics, personal documents, and even photographs taken from guests' luggage. He'd been systematically robbing people who were just trying to get a safe night's sleep while traveling. Hutchins pleaded guilty to multiple charges including burglary, theft, and assault. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and Pine Valley Motor Inn was eventually shut down by local authorities for failing to maintain basic security standards. The building sat empty for about a year before being demolished to make way for a chain restaurant. This experience completely changed how I approach staying in budget motels. I now research any accommodation thoroughly before booking, looking for recent reviews and news articles about safety incidents. I always request rooms on upper floors when possible, never on the ground level where exterior access is easier. I use the door chain and deadbolt every time, and I place a chair or luggage in front of the door as an additional barrier. I also started carrying a small door alarm that makes a loud noise if someone tries to open the door while I'm sleeping. It's a simple device that costs about $20, but it provides peace of mind when staying in unfamiliar places. I've recommended it to other sales reps and frequent travelers, especially women who often stay alone in budget accommodations. The thing that bothers me most about the Pine Valley incident is how long Hutchins was able to continue victimizing guests without being caught. He had legitimate access to rooms through his job, which gave him cover for his criminal behavior. Guests who reported missing items or strange noises were dismissed by management, either because they didn't want to acknowledge the problem or because they genuinely didn't realize they had a predator on their payroll. How many people were robbed, assaulted, or terrorized before someone finally connected the pattern? How many travelers had experiences like mine, but never reported them because they seemed minor or explainable? The woman who was assaulted was brave enough to fight back and press charges, but she might not have been his first victim of violent crime. She was just the first one who could provide enough evidence for police to take action. I still travel for work, though not as frequently as I used to. When I do stay in budget motels, I'm hypervigilant about security. Every sound in the hallway gets my attention. I check the locks multiple times before going to bed. I keep my car keys and phone within easy reach in case I need to call for help or make a quick escape. It's exhausting to be that paranoid, but it's better than being another victim. The experience taught me that predators often target travelers because we're isolated, unfamiliar with local resources, and unlikely to stick around long enough to pursue justice if something happens. We're vulnerable in ways that local residents aren't, and places like Pine Valley Motor Inn can become hunting grounds for people who understand how to exploit that vulnerability. Story number 2. I've always been a light sleeper, which turned out to be both a blessing and a curse during what became the most terrifying night of my life. This happened about 4 years ago when I was driving cross-country to move from Oregon to North Carolina for a new job. I'd planned the trip to take about 4 days, staying in different motels along the way to break up the long drive and give myself time to see some parts of the country I'd never visited. Day 2 of the trip brought me to eastern Montana, an area that's basically empty space between small towns connected by long stretches of interstate highway. I'd been driving for about 8 hours and was getting tired enough that continuing would have been dangerous. According to my GPS, the next town with lodging options was still 40 miles away, but there was a place called Sunset Lodge just 5 miles ahead. Sunset Lodge wasn't the kind of place I would have chosen under normal circumstances. It was clearly an old-fashioned motor lodge that had seen better days. The kind of place that probably catered to long-haul truckers and people who needed a room for just a few hours. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few semi-trucks and a couple of beat-up cars. But I was exhausted, and the idea of driving another 40 miles in my current state seemed more dangerous than staying at a sketchy motel. The front office was small and cluttered, with wood paneling that might have looked stylish in 1975, but now just looked dated and grimy. Behind the counter was a man who appeared to be in his 70s, thin and weathered, with the kind of deep tan that comes from spending decades in harsh sunlight. He looked me over carefully when I asked about a room, taking in my out-of-state license plate, visible through the window, and my obvious status as a traveler passing through. $45 for the night, he said, cash only. Checkout's at 11. I normally prefer to pay with credit cards when traveling, both for the protection and for expense tracking, but I was too tired to argue or look for alternatives. I handed him $50 cash and waited for change. He gave me a key attached to a wooden block with the number 8 burned into it and pointed toward a row of connected rooms facing the parking lot. Room 8 was about what I expected. Worn furniture, faded wallpaper, and that particular smell that cheap motels have a combination of old cigarette smoke, industrial cleaning products, and years of accumulated humanity. The bathroom was small, but appeared clean, and the bed seemed functional, if not comfortable. I'd stayed in worse places, though not many. I brought in my overnight bag and settled in for the evening. I was planning to get up early and drive another 8 hours the next day, so I wanted to get as much sleep as possible. I showered, checked my phone messages, and was in bed by 9:30 p.m. The air conditioning unit was noisy, but I was tired enough that I thought it wouldn't keep me awake. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly with the distinct feeling that something was wrong. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I lay still, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. That's when I heard voices outside my room, low conversation between what sounded like 2 men. At first, I assumed they were other guests heading to their rooms, or maybe truckers getting an early start on their day. But as I listened more carefully, I realized they were talking specifically about my room. I could hear phrases like Oregon plates, and traveling alone, and cash payment. My stomach dropped as I understood that they were discussing me and the information I'd provided when checking in. I got out of bed quietly and moved to the window, being careful not to disturb the heavy curtains that covered it. Through a small gap, I could see 2 men standing near my car, examining it closely. One was older, heavy-set, wearing what looked like work clothes. The other was younger, probably in his 30s, and was holding what appeared to be a small flashlight that he was using to look inside my car windows. They spent about 10 minutes examining my vehicle, looking in the windows, checking the license plates, and testing whether the doors were locked. Then they moved closer to my room and stood right outside the door, their voices too low for me to understand specific words, but clearly discussing some kind of plan. I was terrified. 2 men were obviously planning something involving me, my car, or my room, and I was alone in an isolated motel with no other guests nearby except long-haul truckers who might not even be in their rooms. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't even sure what county I was in, and I didn't know if local law enforcement would take a call seriously from someone reporting suspicious conversation outside a motel room. Instead, I decided to get dressed quietly and prepare to leave if necessary. I packed my overnight bag as silently as possible and located my car keys and phone. If these men tried to enter my room or continued to act suspiciously, I planned to run to my car and drive away, even if it meant driving all night to reach safety. The voices outside continued for another 20 minutes, occasionally interrupted by the sound of footsteps moving away and then returning. At one point, I heard what sounded like someone trying the handle on my door, very gently, like they were testing whether it was locked. I held my breath and remained completely still, hoping they would think the room was empty or that I was a heavy sleeper. Around 2:30 a.m., the voices moved away from my immediate area, but I could still hear conversation coming from somewhere else in the motel complex. I waited another hour, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate they were coming back. When everything seemed quiet, I crept to the window again and looked out. My car appeared to be undisturbed, and I didn't see anyone in the immediate vicinity. But I also didn't see the 2 men anywhere, which meant they could be hiding or waiting somewhere I couldn't see. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying until morning, I was going to leave immediately. I gathered my things and approached the door cautiously. The lock was a simple deadbolt with no security chain, and the door itself felt flimsy, like it wouldn't take much force to break it open. I unlocked it slowly, opened it just a crack, and listened for several minutes. When I was reasonably confident no one was waiting outside, I stepped out and moved quickly toward my car. I'd made it about halfway across the parking lot when I heard shouting from the direction of the front office. 2 voices yelling at each other, though I couldn't understand what they were saying. I didn't stop to investigate. I got in my car, started it immediately, and drove out of the parking lot as fast as safely possible. As I pulled onto the highway, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw lights turning on in several rooms at the motel. Whatever had been planned for that night, my departure had apparently disrupted it. I drove for another 2 hours before stopping at a well-lit truck stop where I felt safe enough to rest for a few minutes and figure out my next move. I never reported the incident to police because I didn't have concrete evidence that a crime had been attempted. Suspicious conversation and examining someone's car aren't necessarily illegal, and I couldn't prove that the men had intended to harm me or steal my property. But I was convinced that something bad had been planned for that night. About a year later, I was reading news online and happened to search for information about that area of Montana, curious about whether there had been any crime reports that might validate my suspicions. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. Sunset Lodge had been the subject of a police investigation 6 months after my visit. A traveling salesman staying there had been robbed at gunpoint in his room during the night. The perpetrators had used a key to enter his room while he was sleeping, threatened him with a weapon, and stolen his cash, credit cards, and laptop computer. The salesman reported that the robbers seemed to know exactly which room he was in and how much money he was carrying. The investigation revealed that the motel's owner and his son had been systematically targeting solo travelers who paid cash and appeared to be carrying valuable items. They would gather information during check-in, observe guests' vehicles and belongings, and then rob selected victims during the night using master keys to access rooms. The scheme had been operating for over 2 years before someone was finally victimized who was willing and able to pursue prosecution. Most previous victims had been travelers who just wanted to get away and continue their journeys rather than spend days dealing with police investigations and court proceedings in an unfamiliar location. The owner and his son were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of robbery, theft, and conspiracy. During the investigation, police found stolen property from dozens of victims, including items that dated back several years. Credit cards, electronics, jewelry, and even personal documents that had been taken from travelers who thought they were just getting a safe night's sleep. Both men pleaded guilty and received prison sentences. Sunset Lodge was shut down permanently, and the property was eventually sold to someone who demolished the buildings and converted the land to agricultural use. Reading about this case confirmed what I'd suspected that night. The conversation I'd overheard about Oregon plates and cash payment had been the owner and his son planning to rob me. If I'd stayed until morning, if I'd been a heavier sleeper, if I hadn't trusted my instincts about the suspicious behavior, I would have become another victim of their operation. The experience taught me several important lessons about staying safe while traveling alone. First, trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly what's bothering you. Second, always pay with credit cards when possible, both for financial protection and because cash payments can make you a target for robbery. Third, research accommodations beforehand when possible, looking for recent reviews and any news reports about safety incidents. I also learned to be more strategic about where I stay when traveling long distances alone. Chain hotels and motels, even budget ones, are generally safer than independent operations because they have corporate policies about security and employee background checks. They're also more likely to have security cameras and other measures that deter criminal activity. Most importantly, I learned that it's better to drive a little farther or pay a little more for accommodation than to put yourself in a potentially dangerous situation just to save time or money. The hour I saved by stopping at Sunset Lodge instead of driving to the next town could have cost me much more than just inconvenience. I still take long driving trips occasionally, but I'm much more careful about where I stay and how I conduct myself when checking in. I don't discuss my travel plans with front desk clerks. I park my car where it's visible from my room when possible, and I always trust my gut when something feels off about a place or situation. Story number 03. The third incident I want to tell you about happened during what was supposed to be a simple overnight stop during a family vacation. My wife, Sarah, and I were driving from Chicago to Denver with our 2 kids, ages 8 and 10 at the time. We'd planned to make the trip over 3 days, staying in family-friendly hotels along the way and turning the drive into a mini adventure for the kids. Day 1 had gone smoothly. We'd driven about 6 hours, stopped at several interesting roadside attractions, and spent the night at a nice chain hotel in Iowa. The kids had enjoyed the pool and continental breakfast, and we were all looking forward to continuing the journey. Day 2 started well, but as we got deeper into Nebraska, we ran into unexpected problems. First, our air conditioning started acting up, making the car uncomfortably hot during the afternoon hours. Then, about an hour outside of North Platte, we got caught in a severe thunderstorm that made driving dangerous. We had to pull over twice to wait for the worst of it to pass, and by the time we reached North Platte, it was already 8 p.m., and the kids were cranky from being cooped up in the car all day. I'd planned to drive another 2 hours to our reserved hotel room, but the combination of bad weather, equipment problems, and tired children made continuing seem like a bad idea. Sarah suggested we find a place to stay for the night in North Platte and continue to our original destination the next morning. It would throw off our schedule slightly, but it seemed like the safer choice. The problem was that North Platte was apparently hosting some kind of regional baseball tournament that weekend, and most of the decent hotels were booked solid. We called ahead to several places and found either no availability or prices that were inflated because of the demand. Finally, I found a place called Western Inn that had rooms available at a reasonable rate. Western Inn was definitely a step down from the chain hotels we usually stayed in when traveling with the kids. It was an older property, probably built in the 1960s, with that distinctive architectural style of long, low buildings arranged around a central parking area. The exterior needed updating, but it seemed clean and family appropriate. More importantly, they had connecting rooms available, which would give us and the kids some space while keeping everyone close together. The front desk clerk was a pleasant woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely happy to help us find accommodation on short notice. She explained that they were indeed busy because of the baseball tournament, but that our connecting rooms were in a quiet section away from most of the other guests. Room 14 for Sarah and me, room 16 for the kids, with a door between them that we could leave open or closed as needed. The rooms were exactly what I expected from a budget motel. Clean but dated, with furniture and decor that hadn't been updated in years. The kids were excited about having their own room, even though it was connected to ours, and Sarah and I were just relieved to be out of the car and settled for the night. We ordered pizza from a nearby restaurant and let the kids watch TV while we planned the next day's drive. Around 9 p.m., we put the kids to bed in their room and settled into our own room to relax and get some sleep. The connecting door was open so we could hear if they needed anything, and both rooms had exterior doors that opened directly onto the parking lot. I made sure both exterior doors were locked and deadbolted before we went to bed. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of voices outside. At first, I thought it might be other guests returning to their rooms, or maybe people from the baseball tournament celebrating late. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were coming from directly outside our rooms, and they were speaking quietly, like people trying not to be overheard. I got up and looked through the peephole in our door. The exterior lighting was adequate, and I could see 2 men standing near the kids' room, looking at the door and windows. One was pointing at something, maybe the room number or the lock mechanism. They appeared to be having a serious conversation about something, though I couldn't hear specific words through the door. My first thought was that they might be hotel employees dealing with some kind of maintenance issue, though it seemed like an odd time for that kind of work. But then I noticed they weren't wearing uniforms or carrying tools, and their body language seemed furtive rather than official. They kept looking around like they were checking to make sure no one was watching them. I woke Sarah quietly and told her what I was seeing. She looked through the peephole and confirmed that 2 men were indeed examining our children's room from the outside. We both agreed that the situation felt wrong, even though we couldn't point to anything specifically threatening about it. Sarah went to check on the kids, while I continued watching through the peephole. Our 8-year-old daughter Emma was a light sleeper, and she was awake, sitting up in bed and looking toward the exterior door of their room. "Daddy," she whispered. Someone was trying to open our door. My heart started racing. Emma explained that she'd woken up when she heard the door handle rattling, like someone was testing whether it was locked. She'd been too scared to say anything, but she'd been lying there listening to sounds outside for several minutes before I came to check on her. I looked through the peephole again, and the men were still there, now examining the windows of the kids' room. One of them had what looked like a small tool in his hand, possibly a screwdriver or pry bar. They weren't hotel employees dealing with maintenance issues. They were potential intruders evaluating how to get into a room with 2 children sleeping inside. I made a quick decision. Instead of calling the front desk or trying to figure out whether these men had legitimate reasons for being there, I called 911. I explained that we were guests at Western Inn with our children, and that 2 men were outside our kids' room trying to gain access. The dispatcher took the information seriously and said they would send officers immediately. While we waited for police, I kept watching through the peephole, and Sarah stayed with the kids. The 2 men continued examining our rooms for another few minutes, then moved away toward the far end of the parking lot. They didn't leave the property, though I could see them standing near a dark-colored pickup truck, apparently waiting for something. Police arrived within 10 minutes, which felt like an hour while we waited. I watched through the peephole as 2 officers approached the men near the pickup truck and began questioning them. The conversation lasted for several minutes, and at one point, I could see one of the officers taking notes while the other examined something in the truck bed. About 20 minutes later, one of the officers came to our door. He explained that they had detained the 2 men for questioning and found burglary tools in their vehicle. The men claimed they were looking for a friend's room, but they couldn't provide a name or room number, and their explanation for having crowbars and lockpicks wasn't convincing. It turned out the 2 men were not guests at the motel and had no legitimate reason for being on the property. They had been systematically checking rooms, looking for easy targets to burglarize. The officer explained that travelers, especially families with children, are often targeted because they're assumed to be carrying cash, electronics, and other valuables, and because they're unlikely to be familiar with local resources or stick around to pursue prosecution if crimes occur. The men were arrested and charged with attempted burglary and possession of burglary tools. During the investigation, police discovered that they had been responsible for several break-ins at motels in the area over the previous month. They specifically targeted families and solo travelers who appeared to be passing through town rather than locals who might be more likely to recognize them. The desk clerk at Western Inn was horrified when she learned what had happened and apologized repeatedly for the security failure. She explained that the motel didn't have security cameras or overnight staff, and that guests were generally responsible for their own safety once they checked in. She offered to refund our room charges and help us find alternative accommodation. But since the immediate threat had been resolved, we decided to stay for the rest of the night. The next morning, we packed up early and continued our trip to Denver. The kids were shaken by the experience, but handled it better than I expected. We used it as an opportunity to talk about personal safety and the importance of trusting their instincts when something feels wrong. Emma, in particular, was proud that she'd stayed alert and reported the suspicious activity, even though she was scared. This experience taught me several important lessons about traveling with children. First, connecting rooms can actually create additional security vulnerabilities because they give potential intruders multiple access points to consider. Second, budget motels often lack the security measures that families need, such as adequate lighting, surveillance cameras, and overnight staff presence. Most importantly, I learned that criminals specifically target traveling families because they assume we're carrying valuables and are unlikely to stick around for lengthy legal proceedings. Our out-of-state license plates, luggage visible in the car, and presence of children all marked us as ideal victims for people looking to commit crimes against travelers. Since that incident, I've changed how I approach family travel. I research accommodations much more thoroughly, looking specifically for places that have good lighting, security cameras, and 24-hour front desk coverage. I request rooms on upper floors when possible, never on ground level, where exterior access is easier. I also make sure not to leave anything visible in our car that might attract attention from potential thieves. We still take family road trips, but I'm much more vigilant about security and much more willing to trust my instincts when something feels off about a place or situation. The inconvenience of finding alternative accommodation or driving a little farther to a safer location is nothing compared to the potential consequences of putting my family at risk. The two men who were arrested that night were eventually convicted and sentenced to several years in prison for the series of motel break-ins. The prosecutor told us that our willingness to call police and testify about what happened was crucial in stopping what had been an ongoing pattern of crimes against travelers. Sometimes doing the right thing in a scary situation can prevent other families from becoming victims of the same criminals. Looking back, I'm grateful that Emma woke up when she heard someone trying their door, and that she was brave enough to tell us what was happening even though she was scared. If she'd been a heavier sleeper, if we hadn't taken her report seriously, if we'd convinced ourselves there was a harmless explanation for what was happening, the outcome could have been much different. Sometimes the people trying to hurt you are counting on your willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt.